Bonjour and welcome everyone. My name is Matthias. I'm part of the team behind ChangemakerXchange, a global network that supports and connects young social entrepreneurs, changemakers and activists all around the world. Now, climate change is more than statistics. It is more than data points. It's more than zero net targets. It's about the people. It's about the people who are impacted right now. As I was preparing for this session, I couldn't take my mind off these words from Vanessa Nakate. And while the recent COP27 announcement of a loss and damage fund for the most vulnerable and hardest hit communities and countries is, on paper, a reason for hope, we should not forget that the climate crisis is here already. It's affecting lives already, and urgent action is required. And while the world leaders are still negotiating the details of the loss and damage agreement without any money in big sizes flowing yet, they talk, but we need action right now. Vanessa Nakate is a climate activist from Uganda. She's the founder of Fridays for Future in her country and has spent months alone demonstrating in front of the parliament. She's also the founder of the Rise Up climate movement, which aims to amplify the voices of activists across Africa. Her work includes raising awareness about the danger of climate change, the causes and the impacts. And it is my utmost pleasure and my great honor to welcome her here to Change Now. Vanessa, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. After decades of advocacy by Pacific leaders and climate activists, we helped to achieve an historic breakthrough at last year's climate change negotiations. Finally, at COP27, the countries agreed to establish a fund for loss and damage, a fund that could start to offer support to those who are already losing livelihoods and lives as a result of the impacts of ravaging storms, endless drought, and rising tides. So what is needed now? So many things. Yes, the countries reached an agreement to set up a fund, but how? And where is the money needed to fill it? A report co-written by Nicholas Stern last November found that developing and emerging countries will need $2 trillion per year by 2030 to cope with climate breakdown. The numbers are so large, they are almost impossible to comprehend. Whatever the sum really is, it is much larger than it needed to be. And that is because the fossil fuel companies lied. It is clear now that they knew what they were doing. They ramped up production and piled up their profits, all while our planet cooked and people suffered. And governments enabled the fossil fuel industry and promised action, but delayed and delayed and delayed. So what is needed? Money is needed, real money, and it needs to come now. People are already suffering and dying. Estimates of the total losses from the recent floods in Pakistan alone are $40 billion. And millions of people are already to flee their homes to find water, food, and safety. A recent report said more than 1 billion people face being displaced within 30 years as the climate crisis worsens. 1 billion people. The numbers are so large, they are almost impossible to comprehend. So what is needed is money, real money, and now. And it must come in the form of grants and not loans. The last thing the poor, debt-ridden, climate-vulnerable countries need is to pay high interest rates to rich global north countries for loans to help them address a crisis they have done nothing to create. In fact, many of the global north countries got rich in the first place by extracting, selling, and burning fossil fuels. And they are getting richer and richer still. Energy Monitor reported that the combined profits of some of the world's biggest oil companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Total Energies, amounted to nearly $200 billion in 2022. The numbers are so large they are almost impossible to comprehend. And while their profits piled up, so did the emissions. Wet bulb conditions, where the temperature combined with humidity will not allow human the ability to sweat to cool themselves, and their bodies will begin to suffer. Record heat has burned through over 2 million acres of land in Alberta. For several weeks, a blistering heatwave has ravaged Spain, with temperatures 15 degrees Celsius warmer than expected for April. Scientists now believe parts of Spain are tipping towards desertification. Delhi recorded a temperature of over 46 degrees Celsius this week. The numbers are so large, they are almost impossible to comprehend. So money, real money, and in the form of grants and not loans, and debt relief, and now. And on top of that, we need to make sure the money gets to those who need it the most, to the communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, the people who are losing everything and not lining the pockets of rich leaders. So money, real money, in the form of grants and not loans, and debt relief, and into the hands of those who need it most, and now. But there is something else. While we rightfully should celebrate the breakthrough on loss and damage and push for finance to start flowing there, is something that must stop. And that is finance for new fossil fuels. Let's be very clear here. More fossil fuels equals more fossil fuels. Call for the need for loss and damage funds, and at the same time advocate for developing new coal, oil, and gas. The IPCC has been very clear. Crashing through the guardrails of 1.5 degrees Celsius risks creating tipping points that will unleash hell upon people all around the world, especially in the global south. The IEA has been very clear. We have enough existing fossil fuel reservoirs to manage a clean energy transition. And we cannot have any new fossil fuel development if we are to have a fighting chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The United Nations Secretary General has been very clear. Any new finance for fossil fuels would be moral and economic madness. Of course, this will not be easy. The leaders like to remind us of this. Ironically, it will be much more challenging because many of those same leaders delayed and delayed. But now we are here. We need a global, just, and equitable phase out of coal, oil, and gas. And the first step in phasing out fossil fuels is no new. No new coal, no new oil, no new gas. We need to combine that with an immediate and massively scaling up of investment in renewable energy, especially in the global south. While the numbers involved in all of this are so large, they are almost impossible to comprehend. There are some simple truths. We cannot just focus on the consequences of the climate crisis. We must call out the cause. It is fossil fuels. COP28 cannot be about reducing emissions through technologies that are nowhere nearby ready. The UAE must facilitate the world in agreeing to phase out all fossil fuels. They must also ensure that finance going to the poorest countries to fund this transition is hugely increased, and there must be real money for mitigation and adaptation. But we have waited too long, and now we must have real money for loss and damage. And it has to start now. When you see a family or a friend or a child in a burning house, the first thing you do is to stop the fire and rescue their lives. But what we are seeing now is when someone sees a family in a fire and runs to build them another home, they may never get to enjoy the comforts of that new home. So that's why it's important for us to address the cause of the crisis. Get people out of the fire, help them recover, and restart their lives. No more excuses, no more delay, no more broken promises, no more lies, no more new fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, for your touching words. My head is spinning and my heart is breaking as I hear you state these facts that are known to so many of us, but still mind-boggling in the sense that nothing is really done about it. Vanessa, I would love to ask you probably quite a simple yet powerful question. If you were in the audience or elsewhere and had to do one thing right now, what would you do? Where would you start? How would you get involved as a citizen, as an employee, as someone trying to do the right thing? What are you suggesting?
Thank you so much for that question. One, I think it's important for all of us to understand that there is something that we must do to address the climate crisis. There is a role and responsibility for all of us. It doesn't just lie with young people. Many times I say, even in what you do, you can add climate activists to that. That if you are a teacher, you can use that platform as a teacher to educate your students starting now. That if you are a journalist, you can use that platform to tell and amplify the stories of those on the front lines of the climate crisis. Because every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. If you are a lawyer, a judge, we've seen cases being taken to courts by activists. So it's really about seeing your part in the movement. Not everyone will go to the streets. Not everyone will be able to do that. But in whatever work that you're doing, find how you can use your skills, your resources, and your platform to advocate for climate justice.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. A second quick question. As we are approaching the next COP conference already, at the end of the year, what will you be lobbying for as the source of the money? Is it the states? Is it the G7? Is it the fossil fuel companies? Is it a fund that combines all of these? What do you propose as the source of this money, and how can we all help to push for that?
Well, honestly, as you can see, I am not a loss and damage expert, but I am someone who has seen the impacts of the climate crisis in different places, especially in Africa. And currently, our message is we have the fund, but it's still empty. And we need that fund to have money as soon as possible. So I leave that to the loss and damage experts in guiding us on who needs to put in how much. But like you had, many countries in the global north, they profited on the burning of fossil fuels. And those, that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, they didn't cause this crisis. So it goes back to who has that responsibility to pay for loss and damage, those that caused the climate.
We will just wait a moment and see. Vanessa, you were cutting
you
up
hear
for
me?
you were cutting up for just 1 second. You were saying that it's the responsibility of those that caused it, which is a very good point. Do you want to finish that thought?
Yes, yes, yes. I just wanted to add that we know who caused the crisis and we know who needs to pay for this. And I think there is for learning from the loss and damage experts or climate finance experts in guiding us in how to make this happen. The most important thing is that the money gets to the communities that need it the most, and that this money comes in the form of grants and not loans. Again, like I said, using your place, in the movement to contribute to that. I may not be an expert, but I'm using what I've seen, stories and experiences of people on the front lines to say we need money in the loss and damage fund to help people that are suffering right now.
Thank you very much, Vanessa Nakate. And thank you for the work that you do. We pledge to be by your side and join the fight. And thank you for spending your time with us today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Everyone, thank you for being here to this exciting conversation. We are going to, in just a moment, continue with a panel discussion with very exciting guests. Before we do that, I want to bring your attention to what you see up here on screen, which is Fanny Didou, a graphic facilitator who's facilitating or designing and capturing the essence of the conversation live. And at various points of the conversation, we're going to see some progress of that image. Without further ado, I'd love to now welcome Omnia Omrani, Pim Sullivan-Tailyour, and Nathan Metenier up on stage. Please join me. Hello, welcome. Welcome. Omnia is a medical doctor and was the first official youth envoy for the president of the 27 UN Climate Change Conference and the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs. You're passionate about developing strategies and solutions at the intersection of planetary health, climate justice, and intergenerational equity to unlock the systemic change for the health and the prosperity of people and the planet. And in our briefing, you've emphasized that climate change, besides many other things, is a global health issue. And I'd love to come back to that in just a moment and hear more about it. Pim Sullivan-Tailyour, also to my right, is currently studying environmental sciences and geography at King's College in London and works towards turning schools into places to cultivate hope and foster tangible action in the face of the climate crisis. And young people will be the ones, as we know, that are most affected by the climate crisis in the future, yet they're still not really listened to, and you are about to change that. Nathan, to my very right over here, is a youth climate justice activist and was, until recently, the youth advisor to the UN Secretary General. His work, and may I say tireless activism, happens at the intersection of youth movements, climate change, inequality, and injustice. So a lot of things to unpack here, and very exciting path that took you here onto this stage. The planet crisis affects all of us, and the most vulnerable communities the most, and certainly those that have done the least to cause it are the ones to suffer, which is just a screaming injustice that we hope to unpack a little. Nathan, you have told me, and you keep saying, that climate change is essentially a justice issue, among other things. Can you elaborate a little on that and give us an insight into your thinking and into your work?
Well, that's a big task to fulfill after Vanessa talking, and some of you have already heard me talk today. I think that I'll share a little bit about where I come from and my positionality in the climate justice debate. I grew up as a queer child in the Alps. I'm actually French, even though I reside in Canada. And as I was, grappling with my identity and working on these issues, and also witnessing, the polarization today, of course, especially on the other side of the Atlantic, but it's coming, surely, in Europe as well. The marginalization and discrimination that queer people are being victim of. And I had that on one hand, and on the other hand, I had, witnessing the climate impacts in the Alps. Many of you probably have family there or are going there. I mean, we don't even have glacier there. It's crazy. In 15 years, I've seen the Mont Blanc completely disappearing. And thinking about those two issues, those two crises, one very personal and one very global, I realized that the root causes were actually very much the same. Patriarchy, colonization, white supremacy, heteronormativity. Sorry, these are big concepts, but both those crises actually have somehow the same roots. And I think that, if anything, climate justice is an invitation to invite the equity, to invite the fairness into our very climate sustainability conversations. No, doing renewable energy is not always good. If you steal indigenous land, if you use renewable energy and carbon credits to buy lands that don't belong to you, that reproduces inequality. If you use massive materials to build the new billions of EVs that car companies are selling us, this is not gonna bring us more climate equity. And again, and again, and again. And I think that it is really important, like Adenike said earlier today, that everyone really thinks about climate change, about the planetary crisis, the multiple crises that we're facing from an equity and fairness perspective, because obviously it can be another opportunity for another form of sustainability. And actually, do you know who are the biggest investors in renewable energy right now? It's the fossil fuel industry. And I'll leave you to think about that.
So Nathan, to just quickly touch upon that again, you are saying that the climate crisis isn't just accelerating injustice, and it's unjust in the sense of who's being affected. You are also saying that by creating more justice and equality, we have a powerful remedy and an ingredient to overcome it and to work towards it. So for you, it's sort of, as I understand, two sides of the same coin in a way.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what's really important is to realize that not every green or climate solution is good for the people, and it can do a lot of damage. And this is why it's really important to have those conversations here, where it's all about changing and sustainability and greening the business. Are we greening the business and also enhancing equity and redistributing wealth? Or are we just basically recreating another inequality? And this is a call to action, right? A call to action to say, you're doing great, and you need to do even better in terms of thinking about the people, about diversity, and about redistribution. Does that make sense?
No, it makes total sense, and thank you in advance to bring that really holistic perspective to this wider conversation. One thing won't do it all. It's many pieces to a bigger puzzle. Pim, at a very young age, you've started to organize youth climate conferences in dozens of schools in your community, and you're really working with people in schools that are sort of affected by it the most in the future. And from the eyes of the youth, very practical, can you help us understand a little what are sort of the most talked about issues? What are the conversations that are happening in these spaces? What are they most angry about, most hopeful for? Give us a bit of an insight into these spaces and conversations, if you may.
So I'll start with, as well as what Nathan talked about, was my positionality, which I think is something that we all need to kind of first start off with when we're having these conversations. So I grew up in Southeast Asia and spent the majority of my childhood there. So I experienced the education system there and the way that people approach the environment there. And then I moved here and I saw the way the education system was here and how people felt about the environment here. And but the majority of my perspective at the moment is from talking to students in the global north. So from the students I've spoken to, I would say that majority of their worries is it's a kind of double-edged sword of what contribution can they make, but at the same time seeing that the governments are not living up to the standards that the youth put like expectations for. And despite youth participation, I think a lot of youth who are involved in the climate space are very aware of youth washing. So I think it's a double-edged sword of where they want to be a contributive factor, but it's difficult to tell when is it youth washing and when is it when you're actually making a contribution. And the majority of times in schools anyway, with just students who maybe aren't in the climate space but want to be, there was a study recently at Force of Nature that showed that 85% of young people actually wanted to be in a job to do with climate change or the environment, but only 39% felt like they had the qualifications for it or the skills for it, which I think there's several factors depending on what country you're coming from and the support you had depending on what type of school you're in. But I think the majority of the way that youth have that double-edged sword of wanting to contribute, and then you have the youth washing, and then feeling like whether what they contribute is enough when they're not seeing that the governments are living up to the standards that they wish a government would live up to.
I can imagine that to be very frustrating, and we see it at the rightful and legitimate protests all around the world. So thank you for bringing that perspective of the very young. Omnia, COP28 will for the first time dedicate, as I understand, a whole day or at least a big chunk of the agenda to the topic of health. I'd love to bring that perspective in. Share with us why that connection between the planetary crisis and health is so crucial. Let's start on a very basic level and then dig a little deeper.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, when it comes to how we see climate change, and now there is the powerful narrative and understanding of how the climate crisis is a health crisis, because it directly affects our health, especially the ones that are most impacted with the least access to the resources, to the healthcare services that they need. If I use a very clear example, when we see a climate-related disaster and we see the number of deaths, the number of people who have direct injuries, the emergency rooms being flooded with patients who are able to access the services that they need, but also what's even more impactful is how the mental health of people is affected, and a study shows that it is 40 to 1 when it comes to an extreme weather event. But what is even more common, and what I personally saw as a medical doctor in the ER during the summer, is the high rates of patients coming in with heat stroke. And if they are above 65 and they're not managed in time, they would die.
But that's not going to get better.
But also what we see, especially during the summers, and high rates of crop failures, and many farmers right now are committing suicide because they cannot provide food for their family. Their crops are not growing anymore. They are living in extended periods of drought. And this also affects both their physical, mental health, as well as the health of their families. But I'm not here to just say that the climate crisis as a health emergency and the doom and gloom. It's just now there is a loss of the humanization of what climate change is. And when we saw, for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that was a health emergency. Countries responded. The funds were flowing in directly, but we do not see the same urgency with climate change because, as simple as it affects the most vulnerable communities, and they are the ones that are least represented in the climate spaces, and both their health and their mental well-being is being affected on a daily basis. And it also exacerbates their basic access to food, water, education, healthcare services. And when we look at the injustice at an intergenerational level, the ones that are being affected most are the children and the young people. Right now, 1 out of 5 children lack access to the basic, safe drinking water that they need. And when we look at air pollution, which is caused by the industries that we're surrounded with, 9 out of 10 children breathe in polluted air. 7 million people die every year directly because of air pollution. And only 5 years ago in the UK, the first 7-year-old girl had on her death certificate air pollution as the main cause. So it is a health crisis that we need to acknowledge. But on the other hand, action for climate change is also action for our health. When we look at changing our air, when we look at improving our access to green spaces, to biodiversity, when we promote actions like active transport, when we also look at our food systems and providing sustainable, nutritious dietary change, and all of that really improves our health as well as the health of the environment, because as obvious as it is, our health is dependent on the health of the planet. And we have a responsibility to protect the health of our people and the health of our environment.
Thank you very much, Omnia. Very clear. So I think we're kind of getting to the core of this broader topic, which I know the session is about loss and damage, but I think one layer below is the climate justice and justice issues, and you tackle different aspects of it. I do want to honor, though, that this conversation also wants to bring in that element, and I'd love to start with you and ask you what your thoughts are on the loss and damage agreement at COP27, and maybe also what some activists in your network, the people that you surround yourself with, what are they saying, what's the talk, what needs to happen? Give us an idea of the conversation at the moment, because it is one piece of the puzzle, but as we heard from Vanessa, a lot more needs to happen there. So some thoughts from you would be appreciated.
Yeah. The establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund is, for me, I always see it as a story of how years of activism can then lead to true impact and true mobilization, and really putting in the pressure on countries to act. Loss and damage activists has been there for tens of years, but it was never even an agenda point at the highest level of decision making for climate change. It was only in Egypt that it was put as an agenda point for the first time, and then countries were put under the pressure, especially by civil society, by young climate activists, to establish this fund. But as Vanessa said, it's not just about the Loss and Damage Fund, it's not just about the Adaptation Fund and other finance facilities. It's also about addressing the root causes and addressing mitigation and reducing the carbon emissions, which leads to all of that. But establishing a Loss and Damage Fund is also a powerful message of solidarity, where now countries that have been emitting the most are going to pay reparations for the communities and the people who were impacted the most and contributed the least. To now we're seeing the countries that are in the small state islands that are being destroyed in every aspect in terms of their education facilities, their healthcare facilities, their homes, and even loss of their loved ones. And they have contributed to the very minimum of what we see now with the carbon emissions. And now is the time to pay reparations for that. And we are not just happy that we have a loss and damage fund, it's also about, is this fund going to be accessible? Is this fund going to reach the ones that have been impacted the most? Is it going to be sustainable? We do not just want to have a fund that will take years and years for communities that are affected, that are doing the real grassroots action and still cannot access a very difficult process. We want it to be accessible. We also want it to be made in a way that is co-designed with the ones who have been affected the most. And this is when we would say that we have successfully established an inclusive and an effective loss and damage fund.
What are others, including yourself, saying? Are we seeing that? Is that happening? Is there a reason for hope in making the loss and damage agreement inclusive, diverse, driven by the idea of justice and accessibility? What are you hearing? And I know not everyone's an expert on loss and damage, but you might have some thoughts to provide here as well.
I think something that a lot of people are beginning to understand is that we can't use the same system that caused the climate crisis to solve it, which is why I think loss and damage, if it is put in the form of grants, is such an opportunity for transformation and transformation of the communities that need it most to be regenerative and to move away from those systems that created the climate crisis in the first place. So I think that's something that's really hopeful about loss and damage, and that I hopefully think we can look forward to.
Thank you, Pim.
Well, I'm not the best at that, but I think it's important to do a bit of like what we call in the non-profit world. I don't know if you do that in your businesses, but it's a theory of change. I think that first, looking at what has happened in 2015, all the states, and I said it before, like most of the planet are authoritarian governments, so let's always remember. And when you also look at the states of our democracies, you can also wonder if, you know. So that's the state of the world. They all committed, the global north, at least, you know, like the wealthiest countries, to give $100 billion to the global south to get ready for getting their, you know, green transition, mitigation strategies, adaptation strategies, and they never delivered. And I think that one of the most frustrating things for me when I was a youth advisor is to discuss with, of course, my country representatives, most of yours as well, the French representatives, bunch of white people who work in big fancy offices. They're very well paid. Sorry, that's maybe a bit too much. All of these people, plus, you know, the United States and a bunch of other countries committed to that. And all of them say, no, we're actually almost there. Right now, we're giving about 80 or 90 billion dollars every year to the global south. But this is a lie. Why? Because the way they calculate that is that they look at all the finance that they're giving in terms of private finance, in terms of any, for example, in France, we have the Agence Française de Développement. When the Agence Française de Développement gives funding for a project that includes somehow a little bit of biodiversity of climate, it is the whole investment that is calculated as a climate grant or a climate loan to the country in the global south. So all this money that the global north countries have been saying they're giving has actually never reached the global south because it was never given in true way. And of course, what Vanessa was reminding us today, it's very, very rarely in grants. Actually, almost just 10% goes in grants, which means, you know, money that is restricted, but at least it's given to do the actual work, not just through private finance and so on. And that is so upsetting. I think no one can understand why the UNFCCC process, the UNFCCC is, you know, the UN process for the climate negotiation, is such a toxic space without understanding that, because global south countries, G70 countries, have been lied for decades. And so until that hasn't been solved, I see no possibility that any other funds will work.
I just wanted to add on top of that is exactly what you're saying is the people who are currently meant to be funding them, I feel like they're seeing the climate crisis as something of the future, something that is this blurred image of what might happen, but is that are they really ever going to be affected? And I think we need to also, like, we all know that it's in the present, and that's what the Global South are experiencing. And maybe, you know, they're just not realizing that what we had a session earlier today, and someone showed a picture of the polluted seas that they had lived by, and they raised the question of what would you do if you lived there? And I don't think that is asked enough of what would you actually do if you were in that situation? So, yeah. I think that's
Just like Vanessa said earlier, the people are affected right now. It is happening right now. And I actually really appreciate, Nathan, how you cut through the fog and bring it down to the essentials. So please don't shy away from making bold statements here. That's what this place is here for. And I would actually like to build on that and say maybe a quick round of statements from all of you or whoever has something to share here. Besides the loss and damage agreement, what do you think are sort of the sledgehammer things that we need to do right now, that need to happen? You've talked in the governance session earlier today, for example, about the billionaires, the fossil fuel companies. There were issues of taxes coming up. What are sort of things that you would say have to happen right now that you would want to lobby for and that we can maybe join in and push for together? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think there's so many things, but one thing I personally would like to see how, you know, not just seeing climate change as a health issue, which is something that anyone would relate to, because it's either your health, the health of your children, your grandchildren, the ones that you love, and this is when you start to think about, I need to act. But I would also see it as a rights issue. So your basic right to a safe environment, your right to actually get access to the opportunities that you need and that you deserve, the right to be living in a safe place where you're not worrying about the next climate disaster or worrying about the fact that the place that you're in right now might not exist in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And this is not too far away. So just having the governments recognize that, and also having that sense of credible, meaningful relationship and integration of perspectives of the ones that see that, which is young people, and not just young people, but actually young experts in whatever field that we're in. And having that integration and having our voice really brings in that urgency that is needed, but also brings in that level of dedication and drive to actually center our right and the right of our generation to have the environment that they deserve. I think this is something that I would like to see governments and also private sector and everyone do.
Expand the conversation and make sure that it's understood as a human rights issue. Pim, Nathan, anything to add?
Well, I'll answer based on what I know, which is education and mental health. So obviously, I think education is just the basis of how we should all, it's the beginning of how we all start off anywhere. And I think that educating people to also be critically analyze what's in front of them, especially students as well, I think is really important in looking at the climate crisis and how we should tackle it. And also, yeah, mental health based on what we do at Force of Nature, and also just the difference between how, I think I was having a conversation one time where in the global north we've experienced a lot of eco-anxiety, but in the global south they actually experience more eco-grief because they're seeing that loss of their environments, and how can we support them in that, and also co-produce in ways to support them between whether it's co-production within their own countries or within where we are or different countries together. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of the friends know already, but one of the things that gave me the most hope when I was a youth advisor was to talk with so many different youth communities and learning about what they were doing all around the world. And you know, we didn't just like let the largest environmental movement in history. We also are holding policymakers accountable every day. We're also pushing them to act more. And so I think my hope is that we can do more of that. And so we just released a study that shows that only 0.76% of all climate philanthropy goes to youth climate justice networks that are doing amazing work. And I'm part of a collective that's creating a new structure called the Youth Climate Justice Fund. And it's a youth-led, movement-led, participative groundmaking initiative to kind of superpower youth groups that are fighting for climate justice. And as you could see in this panel, it means various different things, and that's the beauty of it, because we need energy on all those issues, and they're all interlinked. So that's what gives me hope, and I guess it's also a call to action to support it.
Yeah, wonderful.
Will be launched next month.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. After our briefing conversation a few days ago, I got really excited about the fund that you're suggesting, and I wish it all the best. With that, maybe just a quick last round. Things that you work on right now that you want people to join in, what's top of your mind, your heart, a bit like what Nathan did. Maybe Pim and Omnia, you could wrap us up with that.
I mean, we're both working together on, so it is a project called Connecting Climate Minds, and it's looking at climate change and mental health to understand, and both creating a research and an action agenda. So really understanding at the regional level what are the mental health impacts of climate change, and at the same time, how can we develop solutions that are based on these needs. And we're not just creating a series of dialogues, it's actually a community. And we're doing it in 7 SDG regions. So we have regional communities of practice that are being set up. And the most important thing about the project that it is centered on the needs of people with lived experience. They are co-leading the initiative entirely with us, and it's based on their needs, as well as young people who are ambassadors, and they are not advisors, but they are partners in this global and regional mobilization to really set the new narrative, but also understanding and responding to the mental health impacts of climate change.
Wonderful. Wishing you all the best with that. Pim, some last words.
Well, I'm not really connected to any work at the moment, but I think I would just like to leave it on saying that I spoke to some kids a couple of weeks ago who really inspired me, and they had this idea about this business plan and things like that. And I would just like to leave you on to think about when you see something that's good, think about how you can make it better, and always question it, and always think, it might seem good already, but what can I do to make it even better? And how can I make it regenerative? And how can I make it circular? And yeah, I think question everything and continue to
all of us raising our ambitions for what's possible.
So. And try doing it joyfully. And even though this was quite a heavy panel, I think we also
I sense a lot of joy from all three of you. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and honor to be having you on stage and sharing and going through this conversation with you. Thank you, Omnia, Pim, and Nathan, for your contribution. Up next, and for a final conversation of this session, we have Gaia van der Esch, the Managing Director of 3Zero, joining us. Please, Gaia, come up and join me on stage. Gaia van der Esch was born in a small Italian village and raised to be a global citizen, she told me, by Italian and Dutch parents. And after leading the G20 Empowerment Alliance, which works with CEOs and ministers to advance policies and actions that empower women in the workforce, and various international appointments in think tanks, you were recently appointed the managing director of 3.0, which is a global movement to build a world with zero exclusion, zero carbon, and zero poverty. And there's some crazy numbers with thousands of staff in lots of countries around the world and providing support to many millions across the globe. So I'm super excited to have you on stage. Thank you for joining us. And let's start. In our briefing conversation, I got a sense from you, Gaia, that you are someone that is all about action. And I'm interested in the human element here. Where do you think this drive to roll up your sleeves and get active and change things, where does it come from?
Well, as you said, I'm Italian-Dutch, so going to the human element, I think I have a Dutch, very pragmatic, efficient side, but I grew up in Italy, which, I don't know if there are any Italians in the audience, is not a country where much happens, and you need to do a lot by yourself because bureaucracy, decision-making, everything is relatively slow and not very actionable. And I just think it's this mix. I remember being a kid, I grew up in this small village, as you said. I remember being a kid and literally I would always go and see the mayor of the village with my list of complaints of what was not going okay. And it was very stupid things, but for me they were very important back then, such as, I don't know, the scooters that were disturbing our playing area and there shouldn't be scooters. And always going to the mayor with my list of things, okay, this swing is broken, the scooters are disturbing, how can it be fixed? And nothing would ever happen. And I would just, by myself, roll up my sleeve and find solutions. And I don't know, I remember once emptying my dad's supply of wood for the winter and putting it in the middle of the street with all my friends to stop the scooters from entering. So I think it's something that I've always had in the smallest things, but I always kept with me because I think action is really what can get us going, what can make a difference. And of course, it's important to think, it's important to strategize, but to really drive change, even small actions, they're always your starting point, and then they become bigger, and then you actually can make a difference.
Wonderful, thanks for sharing. I mean, I think many people in the audience sort of have a general sense of that connection, but help us understand the three areas that 3.0 is working on, which is exclusion, climate change, and poverty. Where exactly are the linkages for you, and where there's also the areas for intervention maybe in those linkages and in those connections?
I think
paint the picture a little for us, please.
I'll paint the picture. So I come from Europe. So I, of course, come from, let's say, the global north. I started my career as a humanitarian worker. So I was working in the Middle East for quite a few years, on Syria, on Iraq, on the war, the very beginning of the Syria war, actually. And I've been in Africa, I've been in Asia, I've been in many different contexts, right? And I think what's interesting, and also from my experience when I was with the governments, with the G20, what's interesting is that we build global agendas based on how we see the world. So climate change is one problem there. Poverty is one problem there. I don't know, exclusion, democratic participation is another set of problems. But that's not how the world is built. That's not how reality is. This is our way of, everything is connected. Like for a person living in Somalia, it's not like in this daily life, they're like, oh, this is linked to poverty, oh, this is linked to climate change, oh, this is, everything is part of one. It's us that structure systems because it's a way of responding, of structuring, or reflecting, of taking decisions, but it's not how the reality is structured. And I think that's one of the big problems that make also our responses, both in terms of large, big policy making, but also in terms of actual responses on the ground, less efficient, because they're not structured based on the reality, on the people, on their needs. They're structured based on our need to structure, to then be all the ministers of environment sitting together and taking a decision. But if you don't take into account that there are actually connected for the real people on the ground, you're not going to have a response which actually responds efficiently. And you might, for example, lift someone out of poverty, but then, of course, that person becomes a consumer, so the poverty agenda is happy, the climate change agenda is not happy, and there are all these trade-offs that start being created because we don't see things in a holistic way to start with. And that's where we try to come in, right? As 3.0, what we really want to do is to try and help other actors, be it private sector, be it startups, innovators, philanthropy, governments, of course, international aid development actors, which is where we come from as a nature, to work together, because we don't work enough together. When we hear all these discussions, how do we get the lost and damaged scheme to the people that need it the most? The response is not a government fund, because in a lot of the places where there are people that need it the most, governments don't manage to get there because it's fragile states, because it's very remote areas, it's people or communities that are already excluded. So we need to be able to work together in a different way from what we do. I think we speak a lot about it. We don't know how to do it. And we actually want to bring actors to do it in terms of multi-sector platforms that converge for real action for the 2 billion poorest people, making sure that they have a real just transition that we all speak about, but we're not sure how we're actually going to get it off on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you touched on something that also Nathan, Pim, and Omnia touched upon, which is the interconnectedness of all those issues. And it really seems like we have to do everything at the same time, because you can't do a little screw here and a little screw there. You need to address it all simultaneously. There's an impressive number of people involved in 3.0 and the work that you do, and also the number of beneficiaries. I was quite impressed. And you sort of outlined the general approach to what you're doing. Can you specify it a little more practically, maybe with an example of a project, or what exactly is happening on a day-to-day basis in your teams across the world? What are they doing?
So many different things. It goes from, so first of all, it's very action-orientated, right? So the idea is really to bring a difference on the ground. And this difference, though, can look many different things based on the context you're in, right? If you are in Uganda, where Vanessa is, where we also have teams, let's say, that are within this 3.0 umbrella, whether it's in the Philippines, the action is going to look different because the problems on the ground are going to be different. One of the key things that drives us is really to have this people-centric approach and to understand the context, understand the territory, make sure that what we try and do is with the people. It's not like this assistentialist type of frameworks that you often have where you create dependency from external aid, but it's a way of really elevating their solutions, their knowledge, their innovation to fix the problems that they're facing, which we all agree often they haven't created these problems in 99.9% of the cases, but they are people that have a lot of resources and a lot of solutions that we can help scale and help them be the solution to the problem that they have as well, by giving more funding, by giving more capacity building, more resources, more means for that to happen. So we, for example, have different type of activities. We have a whole branch which is real, one of the organizations within 3.0, it's called ACTED. It's an international NGO, one of the biggest ones in Europe, and it's real humanitarian aid, right? So it's 7,000 people working across 45 countries that actually provide immediate relief. And that's working on the immediate survival and the immediate recovery of people that live in these crisis context, right? And that's one thing that is important to do, and it's crucial to do because we can't leave anyone behind because we forget about the most fragile people. But it's not enough. We also need to look then at fixing the system that has created this type of crisis and that continues to create this type of crisis. Otherwise, these people are going to be constantly in a crisis setting, constantly depending on external life-saving assistance, and that number is only going to grow because, of course, the consequences of climate change are going to grow and scale in the next years. So that's not enough, and we also need to work on creating a different capacity within these countries of working across these sectors. And I'm not saying European startup working in Uganda. I'm trying to say like the actual context in Uganda to work together. And then of course we can manage to get some external actors and some knowledge and some resources. But the idea is also to create an ecosystem which is different. So for example, we've started rolling out this new concept, which is 30 houses. And it's actual incubators houses, like a bit the startup incubators you might have in Europe, but in Manila, in Dushanbe. We're opening one in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar. So they're houses that are geared to the local context within these countries that are most affected by climate crisis, to incubate and ensure that different actors within those countries can work together and scale their solutions and be provided with means to really respond to the crisis that they're living. So this is the type of activities we do, from the more immediate life-saving to the more, I don't know, let's gather, let's discuss, let's incubate, let's find solutions, because we need all the energies at all the levels to really make a difference on the ground.
Yeah. I've had the pleasure of meeting some of the people who are involved in your work on the ground throughout the conference. And what really struck me is what you've been talking about, that they seem to really understand, work in the local context. I'm curious to know how you ensure that, because it's obviously a very high objective to make sure that it's driven by the people on the ground, that you give them ownership, that you share the ownership, maybe even the equity of what's happening. Do you have principles, values, policies? Is it in the DNA? What do you do to ensure that and hold maybe yourself accountable to it as well?
I mean,
to not replicate that old model
mechanism. It's a very good question, because the aid system does have a problem, right?
Exactly.
The aid system itself.
What I want to get to.
Yeah, definitely. There is a problem of the aid system with even, okay, myself, I started as an intern, I was 24, I went to the Middle East, I thought I would save everybody and I knew better than anyone else, right? And it took me time to realize that it's not because I'm European that I'm any more entitled than my colleagues that were in Jordan, and that was a little bit the mentality with which a lot of us go into aid type of work. And that's a problem, because you are indeed replicating schemes that are wrong. And it's very difficult to change a system, but we need to change a system. And what we are doing is, of course, most of the staff that we have are staff from these countries. So I would say, like, globally, 85% of the staff are staff that are actually from the Philippines, are actually from Uganda, are actually from the DRC, or any of the contexts where we work. And they are the ones that have that local knowledge, right? If someone like me goes in, I will probably be out in 6 months, in 1 year, in a year and a half. I don't have the local knowledge. I don't understand how the territory has changed, what climate change means within that context, what poverty looks like, because I'll probably spend most of my time in an office doing emails, coordinating, checking with the headquarters. I'm not the person that has that knowledge to understand and to bring the best solutions to the context. So it's a work that we do, but that the entire sector needs to do, of really putting those people that have that knowledge and using that knowledge to empower them to be the solution, not for us to come from the outside and say, this is the solution, this is how you do things, this is how you run an operation. It's a mentality shift, it's a culture shift, and it's difficult, and there are pushbacks, and it's difficult to do, but there's no plan B, there is no option B. Like, that's how it has to be. And so, for example, our 30 coordinators in the countries where we have this type of people, they are from the country. And they are the ones that know their private sector startup, that know the government, that can interact with that system, and that will be there for the long run to really make that change happen. And no one from the external perspective can bring that type of change and have that type of impact.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Gaia, last 30 seconds statement, anything that you'd love to share with the audience as we wrap this up?
Yes, that we need everybody to come on board if we really want to make a difference. Again, it's about action, it's about changing the systems, it's about making a difference at a field level. So if you're interested, if you're like philanthropy and want to find new projects, if you're a startup, if you're an innovator, if you work with government, please join, check us out. We have also actually a similar forum in Paris that is going to happen on the 5th of September. So it'll be great to see everybody there, the 3.0 World Forum, and check us out online and join us. We're still structuring a lot of things, so there are many things that will be coming up in the future, and I hope to see many people here, many people following online joining
Thank you.
us.
Put your hands together for Gaia. Thank you for your contributions and for your wonderful thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you later.
Before we wrap up this session, we have a little last surprise for you, and I'd love to ask you to open your ears, your minds, your hearts, and your spirits for Vincent Avanzi, who's a poet exploring new narratives around the planetary crisis, and he's going to share with us a beautiful poem of his. Vincent, please join us.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you. I'm a Chief Poetic Officer here to re-enchant the world with poetry, and the poetic speech that I have for you today is called The Climate Justice Poetic Resistance. Houston, we have a problem. Let me rephrase that. Humans, we have a poem. Oh, Captain, my captains. In the beginning, the earth was flat. Then it became round. And if we just switch up the letter H of our humanity, the earth might turn into a heart. All we need is love, stage free, to go from human being to being human. That's one small step for mankind, one giant leap of faith for planet Earth. And if we don't have a planet B, we may have a plan C to see the world through poetic eyes and fly like a bird, not a burden. I mean, what is the destiny of our galaxy if not a legacy of harmony? By any dreams necessary, please don't abort unity. This may be our last opportunity to meet our common destiny. Sustainability is our shared responsibility, as vulnerable communities are part of the same humanity. From the G7 to the V20, our duty is to reach a balanced and lasting prosperity, as what we do in life echoes in all the living species as a symphony. So dream high for departure. We got a green light on the future to reconcile us with nature. Yes, today we all rise. Us, not the temperature, but us as mature leaders with the power to heal the one world wonder and share the expenditures of the climate disorder caused by our human adventures. May this be our invitation to embark on a mission possible journey aboard the enlightened leader and partner spaceship. Your mission of life, home, should you decide to protect it, is to take a harmony shot at planet Earth. Not a moon shot, but an Earth shot, to connect the dots and change the plots on our way to the top before the planet gets too hot. Stop. Ready for launch? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Home heroes. 1 global conscience. 2 climate finance. 3 world renaissance. 4 love abundance. 5 human essence. Can you feel the resistance in our benevolence? It's humanity o'clock, and the time has come to care not only about our soul income, but also about the world's outcome. So please come. Departure, home, H-O-M-E. Humanity on mission Earth. Ignition, liftoff, alignment, elevation, collaboration. Orbit trajectory, sobriety, biodiversity, and climate justice. Faraway landing, enlightenment, transformation, celebration. Destination, home, heaven on Mother Earth. Light years of life dreams, just imagine 8 billion people all co-creating equal. A dream we dream together is real, said a wise man from the Beatles. So fight for what's vital, not what's viral. Our planet is a sacred place, not a market with a target, but an asset to protect like a Stargate with a pledge and a global stocktake. So dear activists, world citizens, leaders and change makers, what will your verse be tonight? And what is the price of life? It's time to do not what's easy, But what's right? We are the regeneration. So what will be your contribution to lower emissions, organize a fair transition, and design an enchanted horizon for the future generations? Climate justice is a must, and world peace is more than a plus on the planet's pulse. No matter the cost, either we all win or we're all lost. It's not about the South praying and the North paying. It's about whether or not our kids tomorrow can keep playing. So come on a date with humanity as our one life stand to reverse the trend for a happy end in our promised land with a clear climate action plan. Are you ready? We are many. World harmony. The time of poets and climate justice is coming. Yes, to be or not to be, giving, be healing, and believing, as we're all responsible for the same thing, and that is for the living. So be a poetic leader, imaginary, visionary, even revolutionary. We'll only be successful if our planet remains wonderful. So let's make being useful the new beautiful. You know, in the end, it's not about being the best to win the war. It's about doing our best to heal the world. So welcome to the Gala of Mankind with Gaia for a sustainable nirvana. The future is our next exit. Home sweet home, from humanity on mission Earth to heaven on Mother Earth. As a rebirth, may we see one day the universe in one single unique verse. Thank you, and climate justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for this creative addition of yet another perspective to this important topic. Now, it is easy to despair in light of the crisis that we're facing, but I hope that this session provided you some inspiration and some concrete ideas for what we can all do together. So thank you for being with us. Thank you to the contributions of the speakers, and I hope you continue to enjoy Change Now, and thanks again.